Appreciate the men this morning who have led us. And I want all of us to be reminded that that's exactly what they have done. They have led us. They are not, nor am I, a performer. We don't stand in front of a group to perform. We stand in front of a group to help, to fulfill a need that all of us have to worship and to honor God. And if that is ever the motive, that those of us who stand before a group of people, if that's ever the motive, or if that's ever not the motive, I pray that we will correct that immediately. But I appreciate what these men have done, and I hope that this morning as we spend some time together that I can fulfill something that would be helpful to you spiritually as well. Beth and I have returned from a few days in Somerset, Kentucky. You may or may not know where that is. That's probably irrelevant to the point that I want to make, but we have thoroughly enjoyed our time with brethren there. We stayed with Sean and Diane Bain, both of whom, if I'm not mistaken, were students here at UNA. It's been a while, but we enjoyed our time with them. They have been very close to us through the years. Not only did we enjoy our time with them personally, but we enjoyed our time with the brethren there. It's a good church in Somerset, and I benefit when I go elsewhere because it kind of re-energizes and rejuvenates me in a way. Just seeing other folks and getting to preach in other places is good. I think it's good for me. I think it's good for, hopefully, for people who are there. I think it's good for you that others are able and capable of speaking to this assembly like Kyle did last week. I very much appreciate not only his ability, but his willingness to speak. And I know you benefited from his lessons. I was able to hear part of the first one and plan on listening to the other half of the first one and the second one as well when I can. But I appreciate, as always, his speaking. But it's always good for us to be back, and we do appreciate the times when we do come back. I think today is Dwayne and Teresa's last service with us, at least for a while. They're going to move, if I understand it correctly, move to Maryland for a little while, several weeks, so we're going to miss them. And I told Dwayne this morning I'm going to send him a picture every now and then just so he doesn't forget my face. I told him that, and Ken Alamel said, "Don't do that to me." So I know where you're coming from, Ken. Anyway, we'll miss them, and we'll pray that God will certainly be with them and help them in every way. I want to read this passage to you this morning as we begin. You can follow along on the chart if you can. I'd really prefer that you open your Bibles and turn to this passage as well. This is Acts 11, beginning in verse 27. And in these days the prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch, and then one of them, named Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. Then the disciples, each according to his ability, determined to send relief to the brethren dwelling in Judea. This they also did, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. Agabus is a New Testament prophet. He is mentioned in this passage. He is also mentioned in Acts 21 and verse 10 as he predicts what would happen ultimately to Paul, the binding of him in Jerusalem. And so that's what prophets did. They prophesied about certain things that were going to occur. And Agabus here in Acts 11, Luke records for us that Agabus prophesied of a famine that would occur. Interesting that both secular and biblical history and those accounts tell us that, yes, famines occurred in the days of Claudius Caesar. Some narrow it down to say at least 4 major famines happened. Well, over the 13 years that Claudius Caesar was the emperor of Rome, and the empire, during those 13 years, those 4 famines, secular history tells us that those 4 famines really covered most of the world. Now they were localized in some cases, and this may very well have reference to what many call the second particular famine. But the fact of the matter is that famine was very common. I think it's a little bit hard for us to understand famine. A week or so ago, Steve Klein was here on a Sunday evening and talked to us about the work among Christians in Zimbabwe. I mean, we hear those things, but we don't relate to those things. Not most of us. I can't relate to looking forward to a bag of meal coming to my house, and then every meal eating something relating to that bag of cornmeal. I can't relate to that on any kind of scale. But it was pretty common in the New Testament times. And when we get to a passage then like 1 Corinthians 16, the passage which Danny read for us this morning, just a few minutes ago, as we think about what the Corinthian church was asked to do, Paul reminds them toward the end of this first letter. Now concerning the collection for the saints, I think he's talking particularly about this collection for the famine that we're taking up. As I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, everybody needs to help with this, so also you must do. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. But if it's fitting that I go also, they will go with me. This identifies, I think, a need in Jerusalem. And Paul's instructions to the church in Corinth help them understand what they need to do in reference to that need. And because we feel and because we have an obligation to help with certain things, as needs arise, we have obligations. And not only does this help us understand what that is, but it helps us understand what our obligations are, I think, in areas like that. People need food. Food is a necessity. And Paul's second letter to the Corinthians goes in depth about how those concerns and how what they needed, how people needed to view that, how the Corinthians needed to understand that. And I want you to know there may have been multiple ways for them to be helped. Think about even what Steve said to us. Here's a need. Well, how could we help with that need? I think all of us are touched. Anytime we hear things like that, we're touched. When we know people who don't have the necessities, we are touched by that. But the sending of a gift, the most practical way for us to help with that would be for us to send money so that they can buy the food that they need. And the New Testament is very clear to show how Christians would help other Christians. I think there is a distinction how that would happen in reference to what churches can do and what individuals can do. And I want us today and tonight to look at some things particularly that relate to two chapters in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 as it relates to the legacy that we're going to leave. And I'm going to think about this with you a little bit differently today. I have entitled this lesson, A Legacy Worth Following, which is of course part of our theme lesson this year, but in monetary excelling. That may seem like quite an odd title to you. You know, you may never have heard of a lesson excelling monetarily. But I think that's at least what we're going to talk about this morning. I think that's the essence of what the first part of 2 Corinthians 8 tells us about. I think the title gets to the heart practically of something that we do consider, that this church does consider and are considering and are doing. But we need to be reminded of why we do that and how important those things are. And possibly even could we do more of that? Could we do better about that? And how do we accomplish that? How do we use what we have? All those things are critically important. And as I said to you, I have never been in famine. You can look at me and tell that I've never been famished, as we sometimes say. I have never personally been affected by natural disaster. Some of you probably have. The hometown where I grew up was pretty much destroyed back in 1952 by a tornado. I wasn't around quite that early. I've lived in a state where hurricanes were fairly frequent and fairly common during the right time of the year. And I personally have never been affected by a hurricane or a tsunami or a destructive fire. And I know some of you have been affected by that. I've had people in my pasture and my friends who have been affected by fire that has destroyed their homes or destroyed their property or even any kind of storm damage. I don't remember much in my life where anything really like that has affected me. But I know Christians who have. And I know non-Christians who have. And so what I want us to look at this morning is, then what is it? How is it that we help? And I'm going to say this to you. I think all of us probably get a little uneasy about this money business. I don't know that any of us particularly care for the preacher getting up or someone else getting up and talking about excelling in monetary excellence. What do I mean by that? Well, again, I will tell you that it was kind of hard for me to identify how I wanted to state this, but that's how I chose, because I think it kind of grabs your attention. And it kind of tells us, and these lessons hopefully are going to kind of help us reevaluate, all of us, maybe, and let me say it this way, collectively and individually. How do we accomplish some things that we're going to accomplish? And the New Testament clearly teaches that I have a role as a Christian to help. Now, the question becomes, how do I do that? Do I do that well? Do you do that well? You're going to have to evaluate what you have, and we're going to look at some things, particularly tonight. I'm going to address a couple of those things this morning, at least in principle. We'll look at it more specifically tonight. What about how I view what I have? 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, I think, shows what churches did to help meet the needs of Christians, particularly. We'll look at that. And the chapter offers also some considerations for us to think about individually and collectively, as I have said. So, think about before we read this, I just want you to think about this idea. You know, churches, like people, have reputations. I want you to think about that. You ever heard anybody that's not a part of this church talk about this church? Anybody outside of here who is a Christian, who's not a Christian, you ever heard them talk about College View? You know, when I didn't live here, when I wasn't a part of this church, for years I've heard about this church. I've heard people talk about this church. Most of the time, the things that those people have said have been good, but not all the time. And it's because there is a reputation here, just like there is a reputation in every church. Every church has that. We want to be, all of us want to be all that God wants us to be. Whether we're talking about how we're viewed collectively as our reputation or how we're viewed individually. I want to be all that I can be personally, and I have a reputation. And I'll tell you what, every single one of you thinks something about me. There's a reputation that I have among you. I don't know what it is unless you tell me. I don't know that I'm not suggesting that I'm interested in that. Either way. If it would help me, I'd certainly want to know that. But we have a reputation. We sometimes don't want to think about it, but we do. And today, I want us to think about our role as it relates to, and I'm going to call it this, our collection. Our collection of money that we have just finished taking for this week. I want us to think about that for a few minutes. And let's start by looking at this passage in 2 Corinthians 8. 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 is really an interlude. The thrust of 2 Corinthians has to do with Paul establishing why people ought to believe he's a true apostle. That really is the essence of it. But in the midst of this, here are two chapters. Here's part of this letter that talks about particularly this need. There's a famine. And these Corinthians need to help with that famine. He's going to talk about it. And again, we're going to talk about this today, and we're going to talk about it tonight. They had made an attempt. They were thinking about how they're going to help. And so he begins this interlude, as I stated, he begins by saying this in verse 1. Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, that in a great trial of affliction and abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of ministering to the saints. And not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and then to us by the will of God. I want to ask you a question. How would you rate? If that's all you read, and really, while this is written to the church at Corinth, this is not, at least right now, this is not about them. This is about the Macedonian. This is about the churches in Macedonia. And after reading those 5 verses, how would you rate that church? I'd say that their reputation for giving was outstanding. It's outstanding. And one idea that I want to share with you this morning at the beginning point of this lesson. And I think this is what stands out. The grace of God was the motivating factor. I'm not going to take the time to read these verses, but there are chapter 8. There's about 6 verses in chapter 8 that speak specifically to that. And you get to chapter 9, there are 3 verses that speak specifically to that. And there are words that are used like liberally and abundantly and share and gifts. And all of those things, I think, help them understand not only what the Macedonians were doing, but understand Paul's request. Paul said, this is how you ought to act. And he's saying the Macedonian church has acted that way. I don't have this on the charts, but I want you to take your Bible and I want you to turn to 2 Corinthians 9. And I want to share something with you that I think is important. It has to do with the overall context of what he's saying in these 2 chapters. Notice, if you will, this is 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 8. He says, and God is able to make all grace abound towards you. Now, you're going to find out more about that tonight when we talk about why he's stating that. He's wanting them to finish what they had started. But he says, and God is able to make all grace abound towards you, that you always having all sufficiency in all things may have an abundance for every good work. Now, I don't know if we grab what he's saying right there with just a quick read. But I think it's better understood when you skip down to verse 14 and he says this, and by their prayer for you, who long for you because of the exceeding grace of God in you. And then notice verse 15. Thanks be to God for His indescribable gift. What's the gift? What's the indescribable gift? You know, if I just ask you, what's the indescribable gift that's God given us? You'd probably say, well, it's Jesus. I think Jesus is an indescribable gift, but I don't believe that's what he's talking about here. I believe what he's talking about here is this grace that has been given to them. And I think sometimes we pass over this idea of grace because I do think it's something for us, it's hard for us to get our arms around. We understand that grace is a favor, but when we extend that past just what we think about it, think about what God has done. Because I think what he's saying is, thanks be to God for His indescribable gift of grace. When you think about what God has done for you and the grace which He has extended for you, what will that do for you? It'll make you be everything you ought to be. And when God has given us something that makes us be everything we ought to be, what is that? That's pretty much indescribable. I think that's what he's saying here. So I want you to think about then how that manifested, how that grace, and again, it's in all these verses. So he's going to first of all say, this is what's happened to the Macedonian church. It's what happened now to these churches in Corinth as well. Because understanding the grace of God, folks, is a great motivating factor. If you don't understand, and if I don't understand the grace that God has extended to us, what's that going to do for our motivation? If we don't really understand the nature of what God has done, we just kind of piddle at it, don't we? Well, what brings us, what causes us to get up on the Lord's day? What causes us to attend on a Wednesday night? What causes us to be engaged in spiritual things? But it's because we understand the nature of the grace of God and what He's done. And I think that's exactly what Paul is saying here to the church at Corinth about what happened in Macedonia and Corinth. If you understand God's grace, then you'll fulfill what it is that you've been asked to do. And I want you to notice how the Macedonian church did this. What was their motivation? And how did this grace extend to them? Well, first of all, they gave from an environment of their great trial of affliction and deep poverty. Now look at the words. He didn't say they didn't have much, but they gave. That's not what he said. That may be the gist of it, but what he says is they gave. He doesn't use the word environment, that's my word, but he gave of their great trial of affliction and deep poverty. Not just poverty, deep poverty. Not just affliction, their great trial of affliction. What kind of person would give the way they gave who was going through all that? the kind of person who understands the grace of God. A person who doesn't understand the grace of God is going to be apt to say, you know what, I've got a lot more needs than the people who may really need some necessities. He reminds those Corinthian churches at the very beginning of this is what's going on in Macedonia. Your brothers up north are doing this. Verse 2 talks about that the amount given was seen as the riches of their liberality. That's not what you say about people who are involved in great trial of affliction and deep poverty. You don't talk about the riches of their liberality. But Paul did. And he used that as an example to tell the Corinthians, you need to finish what you've started. And then verse 2 says that their giving brought an abundance of joy to them. I love the language here. Verse 4 talks about, and I think this kind of extends, it says, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift. Look at that. Imploring us with much urgency that we should receive the gift. Imploring us with urgency. Here, take my money, and I'm imploring you because there's an urgent need. Take it and go with it. That's what he's saying. Imploring about an urgency. Who was that? It was those Macedonian brethren who understood the grace of God and who were giving out of their great trial of affliction and their deep poverty. That's how they were giving. And it gave them joy to do that. And then he says that they gave beyond their ability. You know what? It seems to me that when you give beyond your ability, you're making a sacrifice. You're making a sacrifice. We all have ability. We're going to look at that in just a moment. We all have ability to give, but when you give beyond your ability, you're giving really beyond something that may be expected. I think what Paul is saying is they gave past what even I thought they ought to give. They extended themselves beyond their ability. And he would go on to say that they saw giving as having fellowship. That's what verse 4 talks about. It has to do with sharing. People who understand the grace of God, when they share what they have, and today we're talking specifically about money, when they share that, they understand what God's given to them. And when there are needs that do arise, they're very well aware of those needs. And because of the grace given to them, they want to have fellowship. The idea of fellowship, folks, in Scripture has to do with a spiritual relationship. It has to do with spiritual sharing. There's nothing wrong with saying when we eat meals together, when we're in each other's homes, there's nothing wrong at all with saying that we're having fellowship with each other, because we are. It's just in a different sense than the biblical term. Biblical term always relates to something that they're doing that has some spiritual component in it. And they saw their giving as sharing in that work. That's why, and I say this to commend you. And I think this lesson is not an indictment because I don't think we do some of this well at all. Please don't misunderstand it. It's a reminder of what we always ought to be about in reference to this issue. But we need to be thinking about when we give, that we are helping, that we are having fellowship. If it's, no matter what it is, if it's people who have, brethren who have had storm damage, or people who have been caught in a hurricane or a tornado, or if maybe there's been a fire, whatever the case may be, or whether there's just been a famine, as was the case in Acts 11 and 1 Corinthians 16 in reference to what was going on. Whatever it is, we need to see that as having fellowship. We're sharing with them, and we're sharing because that's what Christians do. We don't have to know them. Our sharing, for the most part, probably will not even allow us. I mean, if we are helping Christians in Zimbabwe, none of us can't load up and go over there and help them. I don't even know if that would help. I don't know what that would do other than make it harder for them to feed them and us. So what do? We send money. Whose money? The money which we've given. The money that has been collected. Why? Because there's a need. And so that's what we do. And the purpose of that is, according to verse 4, it's to help saints. Were there non-Christians? You think when those famines were happening in Judea and Rome and those other places where those famines were during Claudius' time, do you think there were people other than Christians who were hurting? Absolutely. Just wasn't the Christians who didn't have any food. It was everybody who didn't have any food. But the purpose of Paul saying, you need to help, the purpose of them helping was for those who were Christians, those who were disciples, those who were believers. That was their obligation as brethren, to help those who were saints. That was their obligation. And the New Testament is clear about that. When we think about our obligation as a church, I think the New Testament is clear about that. I have some obligations individually to help as I can. But notice what the need here is. The need was for them to help those who were saints. And that's stated more than once in this context. And then they first gave themselves. I think this is really the key. And I think Paul indicates that this is the key. But what does that mean? If I said to you, here's this need and we need to help financially. We need to send them money. But then if I said to you, first of all, you need to give yourselves. What would that mean? You can't give yourself, can you? Giving yourself would mean, okay, I'm going to go over there. Or I'm going to go down there. I'm going to go up there. I'm going to help in that kind of way. We can't do that. I think their giving involved their person as well as their possessions. And again, the issue is, what does that mean? The possession issue was easy because the person issue was solved. I think that's what it means. The possession issue is easy because the person issue was solved. Think about that. Once my allegiance to Jesus and to His cause and to His people is determined, then giving to help a need was really made easy, and I think that's his point. They first gave of themselves. Those Macedonian Christians, they were all about their commitment to the cause. Once you're committed to the cause, when the needs arise, the needs are easily met. You're going to always do what you can, and if the cause is what it ought to be, and if you're what you ought to be, you're going to give past that. You're even going to give past your ability, because you're committed to that. That grace that you understand is part of your relationship with God is going to be all about why you do what you do. And that's what he says. So I think one of the keys to understanding the giving of themselves is what he says in chapter 8, verse 12, when he says, "For if there is first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has and not according to what one does not have." Isn't a willing mind the key component to all we do or don't do? That's where it starts. I had a conversation last night with some folks who came to our house that are members here. We were talking about just the essence really of what our faith is and how important that is. And how important our heart is in our faith. And isn't that the main point, even as Brett talked about this morning in the adult class? Isn't that the point of the Beatitudes? When you talk about blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who hunger and thirst, blessed are the merciful, blessed are those who mourn. All that's about your heart. That starts with your willing mind. You're not going to be poor in spirit if you don't want to be poor in spirit. You're not going to mourn or you're not going to be meek if that's not what you want to do. That all starts with that. And then he goes on in that same chapter talking about murder. The issue is not whether or not you kill somebody. The issue in Matthew 5 is, do you hate your brother? That's the issue. That's why he's talking about. That's where it starts. It's not a matter of killing somebody. He doesn't want you to do that. But the issue is, I want you to get your heart right and don't hate the people that don't hate anyone. Or something that I know we understand is, it's not an issue of don't commit adultery in Matthew 5. Now, we know not to commit adultery, but that's not the issue. What's the issue in Matthew 5? Don't lust. Because lust starts in the heart. And then later on in that same really division, he talks about, the doing the charitable deeds and the praying and the fasting. That's not about, the essence not there is how you pray, how you fast, and how you do charitable deeds. Not in the practical sense. The issue is, what's your motivation behind all that? That's what he spends that whole time talking about. It has to do with one's heart. And so really what Paul is doing here is he's reminding these Corinthians about the reputation of another church, right? That's what he's doing. He's just using another church and saying, here's who they are, here's what they are, here's what they're doing. They have a willing mind. You need to have that willing mind. And let me make one more comment about this. After he talks about this willing mind, he also says this. He says, if that willing mind is there, then what you do, it's accepted according to what one has and not according to what he does not have. One thing that I'm reminded of is that Christianity is personal. Christianity is personal, folks. I don't really care on this point. I don't really care primarily about what we do collectively in terms of the point. Now, let me put it that way. Because what we do collectively ultimately is about what we do individually. It's about us bringing these resources together, which is exactly what Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians 16. They were told on the first day of the week, I want you to give so that when I do come, there are no collections. The point of 1 Corinthians 16, and I'm just talking about the language. The point of 1 Corinthians 16 is there are needs that need to be fulfilled. So give on the first day of the week. That's when you assemble. I think that's what the point of 1 Corinthians 16 is. They assembled on the first day of the week. That's the obvious time to give that money so that when he comes, we don't have to collect that money for this particular need. We give because there are needs. Why do we give every first day? Because there's always needs. May not be a famine, may not be an earthquake, it may not be a tornado, but there's always needs that the church has. But everybody has an obligation. And I want to be clear about that. Every single person here has an obligation, folks. And if you, for some reason, are not meeting your obligation, then you need to consider why not. You have an obligation to help. You may say, well, I don't make much money. Do you make any money? Make any money? Well, I'm not really established yet. That's not my point. Well, I'm not married yet. Well, that's not my point. Well, I'm a college student. Well, that's not my point. You have an obligation? According to these verses, you have an obligation to help. To what degree? Whatever you can. What's going to motivate that, Kenny? I'll tell you what's going to motivate it. It's how you understand the grace of God in your life. That's what's going to motivate it. Because that's what motivates everything. It's not just how much I give. Not just when I reach in my wallet on Sunday morning, and hopefully this is not what we do. Hopefully we don't just reach in our wallet, take it out, say, well, I've got a couple of dollars, I've got a 20, I think I'll throw that in. Hopefully that's not how we give. But it's when we stop and say, what has the grace of God done for me? Okay. It's given me more than I could ever ask for. It's done the very thing that I can't do for myself. Then not only am I going to give like I ought to, but I'm going to live like I ought to. See, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, while it's talking about, I think, a specific need, I think it's saying a lot more to us in terms of how we live our life, because it helps us understand the grace of God and how that motivates us. Well, as I said to you, I want to extend this tonight. We're going to look at some other, I'm going to make some observations tonight about the rest of chapter 8, and I want to get into chapter 9. I want us to look and see about some of those things that are important when we think about what it is that we're doing with our money. These are, I think sometimes these are maybe, I don't know if they're hard lessons, but I think they're good lessons for us to at least think about in reference to what we're doing. And I don't know anybody's heart. All I know is what I do and what Beth does. That's all I know about. But you know what? When I preach, that's all I know about when I preach is what I do. I don't know about what you do unless you tell me. So all these lessons, I think this lesson is motivated, or my motivation behind this is just for each of us to try to establish again and maybe reestablish why it is that we do what we do and understand the importance of that. I will say this. We are a very blessed group of people financially. Most of us are pretty well blessed. And that ought to be a strong consideration when it comes to the needs that others have, the ways that we can help, and the things that we can accomplish. And I believe it is. And it's not an indictment, as I said. I think we do that. But maybe it's that we can do that better. And all of us need to evaluate. As I said to you, Christianity is personal. The invitation we're about to extend is personal. I can't come to the Lord for you. You can't come to the Lord for me. I can't change my life for you. You can't change your life for me. It all has to do with every single one of us looking at what God tells us and reacting to what He says. But it all starts with the person's heart, right? So if you're in this audience this morning, your heart is right, and you want to respond to the gospel because your heart's right, then He wants you. But I'm going to say this to you. If your response is anything other than your heart's right, He's not ready for you and you're not ready for Him. But if your heart's the way it ought to be, and you want to give yourself to Him this morning, then that's what we would ask of you. And that's certainly what He would ask of you. Let us help you by making that known as we stand and as we sing.